Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Some fascinating news coming out for the Georgia program on the recruiting trail as former basketball standout Jahzare Jackson committing to the Georgia Bulldogs in the 2024 class to come in and play offensive line. And the Georgia fans that have been rocking with the fellas the last couple of weeks and months as we've talked Georgia recruiting, you guys know what I'm going to lead off with, and that is you bet on these kind of traits. At the end of the day, there are not many Jahzare Jacksons growing on trees. You look at the frame, 6'10", 340 pounds with a 7'4" wingspan. If you're Kirby Smart, this Georgia program, you're betting on those traits every single day of the week. And I think specifically for Georgia, why this makes so much sense is you look at the 2024 class, which he'll be joining. I think he gets on campus in a couple of weeks. You brought in 5 premier offensive tackles, right? You take a look at Daniel Calhoun, Mike Uini, Marquise Easley, Nair Daniels, Marcus Harrison. They did a phenomenal job recruiting the offensive line in that 2024 class, which I think gives you the ability to go out and bet on a guy like Jahzare Jackson, who very well might just not pan out as a football player. But Georgia has put themselves in a position that if he doesn't pan out, you still got 5 offensive linemen that you feel really good about. But the upside with this kid, it's NFL caliber. It's all SEC caliber. So for Kirby Smart, I think this just makes so much sense. Want to talk about Jahzare Jackson. There's not much film for us to break down, but talk about a few different player comps in terms of these jumbo offensive linemen that we've seen have success at the collegiate and NFL level. This is one of those that you guys know. If you guys have been rocking with the fellas, this just kind of fires me up. You just betting on some big-time physical traits, a guy that we don't know what he's going to be as a football player, but we can promise that he's going to be fun to track over the next couple of years. Before we get into it, just want to say thank you to you guys, to the Georgia fans. It's no secret. Been a lot of Georgia recruiting talk over the last couple of weeks. The amount of support you guys continue to show, it truly does mean a lot. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, I would love to hear how you guys are feeling about this edition for Georgia in the 2024 class. And without further ado, let's get into this one. And let's just talk about the physical traits that you are working with right now at 6'10", 340 pounds. I went back to just some huddle and some YouTube clips to kind of see what Jahzare Jackson's body composition looks like. This was not a guy that was necessarily on my radar. One, really thick lower half. Like this, you look at just the lower half of this kid and say, yeah, he can step out and play some football because he's filled out. You see a lot of basketball players who are 6'10 plus. They kind of got really thin lower half. Certainly couldn't hold up in the SEC along the line of scrimmage. You look at Jahzare Jackson and say, that lower half is developed. It makes you feel good about the transition to the football side. And then you take a look at just the traits that you have. He is a very fluid mover. I mean, the ball handling, the footwork down in the post. I'm not a big basketball guy, but you can kind of just sense that you don't see many guys who are 6'10", 340 that have the movement ability, the coordination, the foot speed that Jahzare Jackson has. And so I think Kirby Smart's looking at it and say, hey, the body makes sense. This is a guy that can come in and play along the line of scrimmage in the SEC because, again, he has that thick lower half. And then you combine that with the length, the movement skills for that frame. I think Kirby Smart said, hey, we're going to bet on this kid every single day of the week. And I think, again, more importantly, this makes sense for Georgia specifically. I think there are a lot of programs that just can't afford to bet on a guy like that and miss because they just haven't recruited the offensive line well enough. You look at Georgia, 5 blue chip offensive tackles in the 2024 class, and we know they've just been stacking offensive linemen the last couple of years. That puts you in a spot where you can go out and just take a flyer on a guy like Jahzare Jackson. Again, if he hits, you're looking at an all SEC caliber offensive lineman. If he doesn't hit, you're just fine on the offensive line. It's really no skin off Georgia's back. Not a lot of programs have recruited the offensive line well enough to kind of allow them to take a risk like Jahzare Jackson. I want to get into a few player comps in terms of we don't see many offensive linemen with this kind of size. Let's take a look back at the last couple of years and kind of see some offensive linemen that really have panned out with this size. I think you just look back to the 2024 NFL draft class and say Joe Alt. And Joe Alt coming out of high school was 6'8.5", 300 pounds. And Notre Dame bet on him. He was a guy that kind of put it together a lot more early on than a lot of people thought. Ended up being the number one offensive tackle taken in the NFL draft. You take a look at the NFL. I mean, guy like Dan Skipper, 6'10", 300 pounds, coming out at the high school level, goes to Arkansas, now playing in the NFL. Last guy I would probably talk about, and probably the closest comp you have, is Alejandro Villanueva, a guy that played at Army. He goes to Pittsburgh. He becomes an all-pro offensive tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think you look at some player comps for the frame, which is really hard to find because there's just not many guys out there that have the traits and the frame that Jahzare Jackson has. There's some evidence that shows that these kind of bodies can play at a very high level, not only at the collegiate, but NFL level. That's kind of what excites me the most. And I think the last thing I want to close on is you take a look at this Georgia class in 2024 and just the pure size that you're working with. Daniel Calhoun, 6'7", 365 pounds. Michael Uini, 6'7", 335 pounds. Marquise Easley is the smallest offensive lineman that Georgia brought in 2024. 6'5.5", 335 pounds. Nair Daniel, 6'7.5", 391. Marcus Harrison, 6'7.5", 336. The amount of size and the amount of upside that Georgia has built on the offensive line in that 2024 class, it's absolutely through the roof. And we've seen Georgia develop the line of scrimmage specifically on offense like one of the best programs in the country. And so you're putting in 6 extremely high upside, massive offensive linemen. The chances of 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 of those guys panning out and putting it together, it's quite high. And so you look at Georgia and say, hey, we are just betting on a bunch of traits on the offensive line. The chances of 2, 3, 4 of these guys hitting are extremely high. This is a Georgia offensive line that's going to be one of the most physically imposing offensive lines, not only in 2024, but in 2025 and in 2026 and in 2027 as well. If you're a Georgia fan, I think you are very intrigued by the addition of Jahzare Jackson. I think you trust Kirby Smart in terms of how he's built this roster. You have the ability to kind of bet on a guy that, again, is a boom or bust guy. There's a very good possibility Jahzare Jackson plays 2 years at Georgia, says, hey, this is a little bit different. I might not be able to cut it along the line of scrimmage in the SEC, and he goes back to basketball. And if you're Georgia, say, hey, we got 5 other offensive linemen that we feel really good about, but the potential of him putting it together and becoming an all SEC caliber guy, an NFL caliber guy, it's there. So if you're Kirby Smart, you're Georgia, you're betting on this all day. I am extremely fascinated to see what the development looks like for a guy like Jahzare Jackson. There's obviously a lot of work to do that's put in the weight room, coming from basketball to football. I'm very confident in Georgia to get the body right, to get the physicality right. It's not going to be year 1. It's probably not going to be year 2. You look at 2026 and 2027, we might be talking about one of the better offensive linemen that we see in the country. We'll obviously continue to follow this one. Wanted to hop on, give you guys some of my takes. Again, appreciate y'all rocking with it. Fascinating get for the Georgia Bulldogs. And we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.